They say soul never sleeps, but that night it didn't just stay awake. It watched me. The city felt alive in a way that made my pulse skip, every neon reflection on the wet pavement flickering like a judgmental eye, every hum of traffic whispering warnings I couldn't hear over the stubborn pounding of my own ambition. I was standing in front of the glass doors of Hanul Gallery, smoothing the sleeve of my navy blazer, trying to convince myself that tonight was the beginning of everything I had worked for. I had spent 5 years climbing, networking, smiling too politely, drinking too little champagne at too many events, and biting my tongue every time someone called me exotic as if I were a rare painting, and not a woman trying to make a name for herself in an industry that didn't believe I belonged in it. I told myself that this exhibit, the lost silks of the East, was my chance to prove I wasn't just another foreign consultant with an accent and a dream, but the woman who brought life back into a gallery that had been losing prestige faster than a scandal spreads on social media. I had pulled strings, charmed donors, and even risked a small fortune to secure an ancient embroidered tapestry rumored to have belonged to a Joseon princess. I didn't ask too many questions about where it came from, because the art world has a strange habit of blurring the line between acquisition and theft. And I had learned that curiosity can close doors faster than competence ever opens them. The air inside the gallery was heavy with perfume and pretension, filled with murmurs in Korean, English, and money. Every guest was wrapped in wealth. Men in black suits so sharp they could cut silence. Women wearing diamonds that reflected the gallery lights like stars trapped in glass. I remember standing near the tapestry, pretending to listen to a donor ramble about cultural fusion when I felt it. That sudden shift in energy, that hush that ripples through a room before something dangerous enters. When I turned, I saw him. Jae-min Kwon. At that moment, I didn't know his name, didn't know the stories that circled around him like dark wings, didn't know that entire businesses had vanished overnight because he had decided they insulted him. All I knew was that he moved like a storm wrapped in silk, calm on the outside, but you could sense the violence beneath. His black suit fit him like a secret, his expression carved in quiet precision, his eyes narrow, unreadable, and yet so piercing that when they landed on me, I felt something deep inside shift. Not in fear, but in recognition, as if a part of me knew that whatever this man was, he would change everything. He didn't approach immediately. He simply observed, his gaze lingering on the tapestry, then on me, then back again, before walking straight toward me with the kind of unhurried confidence that made everyone else instinctively move out of his way. His presence was gravity. His silence was command. "Miss Cole," he said, his voice smooth and low, his English precise with that soft Korean cadence that made it sound like music played on the edge of danger. "You have something that belongs to me." For a second, I thought he meant me, and my stupid heart skipped, until I realized he was talking about the tapestry. I blinked. "Excuse me?" He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "The silk piece, 18th century. Stolen from my family's private collection last month." I laughed, because it sounded absurd. "That's impossible. It was verified by—" He interrupted without raising his voice. "By men who are paid to say whatever you need to hear." The conversation had drawn quiet attention from those nearby, their curiosity sharp as blades. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks, the humiliation blooming slowly, but I refused to let it show. I had worked too damn hard to be intimidated by a man who thought he could bully me into submission. "I'm sorry if there's been a misunderstanding," I said, keeping my tone polite but cool. "But this piece was acquired through a legal intermediary. If you have concerns, you can take it up with our legal department." He smiled. Not the kind that reaches the eyes, but the kind that says you'll regret that. "There won't be a legal department once I'm finished," he murmured. Then, almost too softly, he added, You don't know who you're speaking to, do you? Something rebellious in me snapped then. That quiet defiance that had carried me through every closed door, every backhanded compliment, every moment someone doubted me because of the color of my skin or the origin of my name. I squared my shoulders and met his gaze head on. No, I said. And I don't care. The words hung between us like a live wire, dangerous and crackling. The people around us had started to back away subtly, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't meant to be witnessed. But he didn't move. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. And for a long, heavy moment, the air between us felt like it might shatter. Then, just as I began to wonder if I'd gone too far, he chuckled, quiet, slow, deliberate. Interesting, he said, almost to himself. Very interesting. And then he left. No threats, no scene. Just a nod to one of his men, and a glance that lingered on me a second too long before he disappeared through the crowd, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like the aftermath of an earthquake. The rest of the night passed in a haze of strained smiles and forced laughter. People avoided my eyes, whispering in corners, their glances darting between me and the tapestry like I was already doomed. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself that it was just another rich man playing games. But as I locked up the gallery after midnight, the empty corridors echoing with my footsteps, I couldn't stop thinking about his face. Calm, composed, and yet holding a kind of restrained violence that felt almost personal. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and sharp, cutting through my thoughts. A sleek black car was parked across the street, engine idling, lights off. For a moment, I thought I saw movement inside, but when I blinked, the windows only reflected the city's neon haze. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was tired, that men like him didn't waste time on people like me. But deep down, beneath the rational voice that told me to go home and sleep, something darker whispered that I had just crossed a line I didn't even know existed. Because later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the phone on my nightstand buzzed. No caller ID, just a message that read, "You should have listened, Miss Cole." And before I could even think of replying, the gallery's alarm system called, motion detected inside. I sat up, heart hammering, realizing that whatever I had started, it wasn't just about stolen art anymore. It was about power, pride, and something far more dangerous, a man who didn't like being defied. And I had just made defiance my brand. The morning after the message, I told myself it was nothing, a prank, a coincidence, the universe trying to test how easily I could unravel. But the lie barely lasted until breakfast. Because when I arrived at the gallery, the front door was already unlocked, the alarm flashing red, and the tapestry, the one that had been the centerpiece of my entire exhibition, was gone. It wasn't just missing. The glass around it was shattered inward, not outward, meaning whoever had taken it didn't break in to steal. They broke in to send a message. The police came, asked questions I couldn't answer, filled out reports that meant nothing, and left with polite indifference, the kind that says we won't find anything, and you know it. I stood there long after they left, staring at the empty space where the silk had hung, feeling the echo of my own foolish pride settle heavy in my chest. It was one thing to defy a stranger in a crowded room. It was another to realize that stranger could reach into your life overnight and take what he wanted without even breaking a sweat. By noon, the gallery felt like a tomb. Quiet, sterile, filled with the ghosts of all the things I didn't say, and all the things I wished I had done differently. I was still lost in that fog of disbelief when the front door opened again, and the rhythm of my heart shifted, because the man who stepped inside didn't belong to this world of light and art and fragile beauty. He belonged to shadows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black suit that looked too severe for daylight, and though his face was unreadable, his presence was impossible to ignore. There were two others behind him, both younger, both armed, their hands resting casually on their jackets in a way that told me they didn't carry guns for decoration. "Miss Cole," the first man said, his Korean accent heavier than Jae-min's, his tone flat and formal. "Our boss would like to speak with you." I froze, my mind racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding like shards of glass. Was this an arrest? A threat? An invitation? Did I even have a choice? "I don't understand," I began, but he cut me off with the faintest shake of his head. "It's not a request." They didn't touch me, didn't threaten me, didn't raise their voices, and somehow that was worse, because it meant they didn't need to. Power that loud is predictable. Power that whispers is terrifying. The ride was silent. Seoul rushed by outside the tinted windows, and I caught my own reflection in the glass. Pale from fear, eyes wide, lips pressed tight in a way that made me look like a stranger wearing my face. The car wound through the city, past skyscrapers and narrow alleys, until it stopped in front of a building that didn't look like it belonged in either world. Not a corporate tower, not a criminal den, but something in between. Inside, it smelled like cedar and control. The floors gleamed, the hallways were lined with minimalist art, and the air was so quiet I could hear the click of my heels echo like an accusation. When the elevator doors opened, I saw him, Jae-min Kwon, standing near the window of a sprawling office that overlooked the city like a throne overlooking its kingdom. He didn't turn immediately when I entered. He just spoke, his voice calm, deliberate, a tone that made my pulse quicken, not from attraction, but from the unshakable sense that he already owned the room, and I was merely visiting under sufferance. "I told you that tapestry was mine," he said, turning slowly, his eyes finding me with surgical precision. "And now it's gone." I swallowed hard. "Someone broke into my gallery last night. If you think He held up a hand, silencing me with the smallest gesture. "I don't think." "I know." I hesitated, unsure whether to feel offended or afraid. Because his calm was so absolute, it made me question my own reality. He walked toward me, every step measured, his gaze locked on mine like a current I couldn't break. "You defied me in public. You embarrassed me in front of people who measure power in fear. That was your first mistake. Your second was assuming you were safe after doing it." "I didn't know who you were," I said quietly, hating the tremor in my voice. He stopped inches from me, his scent filling the space between us, clean, sharp, expensive, like rain and smoke. "And if you had known?" he asked softly, almost tenderly. "Would you have bowed?" Something in me, maybe pride, maybe self-preservation disguised as arrogance, refused to let him see me cower. "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "I don't bow." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Then, to my shock, he smiled. Not a pleasant smile, a dangerous one, edged with amusement and disbelief. "I believe you," he murmured, "and that's why you're still standing here." He turned away, walking to his desk, leaving me suspended between relief and confusion. His men remained motionless by the door, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead as if none of this was happening. "Sit," he said finally, not looking at me. I hesitated. "Sit, Miss Cole," he repeated, this time softer but somehow sharper. I sat. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed one to me, then leaned against the edge of his desk, studying me like I was another piece of art he was deciding whether to destroy or display. "You have courage," he said finally. "Or stupidity. Sometimes they look the same." "I have principles," I replied before I could stop myself. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing with intrigue. "Principles don't keep you alive in my world." "Then maybe I don't belong in your world," I said, my voice steady now, surprising even me. He smiled again, slower this time, thoughtful, dangerous. You already do. You just haven't realized it yet. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I wanted to argue, to tell him that my life, my career, my identity were mine alone. That no man, no matter how powerful, could rewrite my story. But the truth was, sitting in that glass-walled office high above the city, I could already feel the invisible strings tightening around me, binding me to a game I didn't understand. He finally set his glass down and straightened. You owe me a debt, he said. Not in money, but in respect. And you will repay it. I frowned. How? He took a step closer. You'll work for me, temporarily. You'll manage certain acquisitions. I need someone who knows art, and someone bold enough to tell me no when I need to hear it. I blinked, caught between disbelief and dread. You can't be serious. His gaze hardened, and for the first time I saw it. The predator beneath the polish, the man who could end a life with the same grace he signed a contract. Do I look like a man who jokes? The air between us throbbed with tension. My throat felt dry, my hands cold. But my mind, the stubborn, reckless part that had carried me this far, refused to yield. If I say no? I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and pressed a button. A moment later, an image appeared on the wall screen. The gallery, my gallery, with men moving through it like shadows, dismantling displays, removing art, taking everything. My breath caught. Then your world disappears, he said, his voice gentle, his eyes unblinking. And you'll learn what it means to be erased. For a long moment, I said nothing. The whiskey in my hand burned my throat. But it was the least of the fires I was swallowing. Finally, I nodded. Once, sharply, because even pride knows when it's outnumbered. He smiled faintly, as if that single motion had sealed something far bigger than either of us could undo. Good, he said. You start tomorrow. When I finally left the building, the sun had set. The air heavy with rain, the city lights smeared by water and reflection. I stood on the sidewalk, trembling, realizing that I wasn't walking away from danger. I was walking deeper into it. Because the truth was, despite every instinct screaming that I should run, I couldn't shake the way his eyes had looked at me. Steady, assessing, like he saw more than I wanted to reveal. And that terrified me more than the threat itself. When the elevator doors slid open, I knew I had crossed into a place where time didn't move forward. It circled around power, orbiting men who built empires on silence and ruin. The air inside his penthouse was cool, perfumed faintly with sandalwood and something darker beneath it. A scent that felt like sin disguised as civility. And though every instinct told me to turn back, to flee, to find some way to undo the deal I'd made the day before, my feet carried me inside as if something beyond logic was pulling me forward. The space was immaculate, breathtaking, almost inhuman in its perfection. Walls of glass revealing the sprawl of Seoul's skyline, every window reflecting the storm that was gathering outside, and furniture arranged with the precision of someone who didn't decorate to live but to intimidate. There were no photographs, no clutter, no hint of the man behind the legend, only the quiet hum of wealth and the whisper of dominance. He stood near the window again, a silhouette against the bleeding dusk. His reflection fractured across the glass, like a secret the city wasn't meant to see. When he turned to face me, his expression was unreadable, but his gaze, that calm, unflinching gaze, made my pulse quicken in the most confusing way. Because it wasn't lust I felt, not exactly, but something more dangerous. Awareness, that sharp, electric recognition of a man who could destroy me with a word, but had chosen, for now, to let me breathe. Miss Cole, he said, and his voice was steady, unhurried, yet threaded with an authority that left no space for misinterpretation. "You're late." I glanced at my watch, the one I had worn religiously for years, its ticking usually a comfort, but now it mocked me with its precision. "Only by 5 minutes," I murmured, forcing a calm I didn't feel. He smiled faintly, not cruelly but knowingly, as if those 5 minutes had already told him everything he needed to know about me. "In my world," he said softly, 5 minutes can be the difference between loyalty and betrayal." I wanted to argue, to tell him that I didn't belong to his world, that I had only agreed to this insane arrangement because I'd been backed into a corner. But the truth was, the moment I had stepped into that car yesterday, something irreversible had happened. I wasn't free anymore, not really, and the realization sat heavy in my chest like a confession I didn't want to say out loud. He gestured toward a table near the center of the room, where a set of papers lay waiting. Pristine, precise, printed in both English and Korean, the kind of document that looked more like a sentence than a contract. "Read it," he said, "and sign." I approached slowly, the sound of my heels echoing against the marble floor like a countdown. The contract outlined my employment as a cultural acquisitions consultant for the Baeko Foundation, a name that sounded harmless, almost noble, until you realized it was a front for one of the most feared criminal syndicates in East Asia. My role was to advise on art deals, oversee restoration projects, and ensure that certain delicate transactions remained untraceable. "Why me?" I asked finally, lifting my gaze to his. "You could have anyone, someone local, someone already in your pocket. Why drag me into this?" He tilted his head slightly, studying me with that unnerving stillness that made him seem carved from something harder than flesh. "Because you told me no," he said simply. "Most people don't." I swallowed hard. "That's not a qualification." He smiled, slow and deliberate. "It's the only one that matters." I wanted to laugh, to call him insane, to demand he let me walk out and pretend none of this ever happened, but instead I found myself staring at the pen in his hand. Sleek, silver, heavy, like a weapon disguised as an instrument of consent. And when he offered it to me, our fingers brushed, and for one terrifying, magnetic second, the world outside ceased to exist. His touch wasn't rough or commanding. It was precise, intentional. A reminder that even the smallest contact between us wasn't accidental. "Once you sign," he said, his voice lower now, almost intimate, "you're protected. No one touches what belongs to me." The word "belongs" lingered like smoke. I didn't miss the double meaning, and neither did he. My heart pounded so loud I could feel it echo through my palms as I held the pen. I told myself it was just paper, just ink, just temporary. But the truth was, something inside me knew I was crossing a line I wouldn't be able to uncross. When the pen met the page, the sound was quiet, final, almost ceremonial. "There," I said, handing it back, my voice steadier than I expected. "Happy?" He glanced at my signature, then at me, his expression softening into something I couldn't quite name. "Content," he said, and then after a pause, "For now." He moved to the bar, pouring himself a drink, then one for me, though I didn't ask for it. "You'll begin tomorrow," he continued, as if we were discussing something as mundane as office hours. "Your first task will be to evaluate a private collection, stolen, most likely, and determine which pieces can be laundered through legitimate sales." I stared at him. "So you want me to help you make stolen art legal?" He didn't flinch. "I want you to make beauty survive in a world that destroys everything it touches." There was something almost poetic in the way he said it, and for a brief, dangerous moment, I understood the seduction of his world, the way he could dress corruption in eloquence and make ruin sound like art. We drank in silence after that, the storm outside breaking against the windows, thunder rumbling like distant fury. I felt small in that vast room, and yet somehow, seen in a way I hadn't been in years. He asked nothing else of me that night. No threats, no orders, no touch. Just silence, heavy and charged. As if we were both waiting for something inevitable to happen. At one point, he walked past me, his sleeve brushing my shoulder, and though it was barely contact, it felt like an unspoken promise or maybe a warning. His voice came from behind me, low and thoughtful. "You're not afraid of me," he said. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was complicated. Fear wasn't the right word for what I felt. It was fascination dressed as defiance, attraction built on the edge of survival. Finally, I said, "Maybe I just haven't seen what I should be afraid of yet." He chuckled softly, and the sound made something inside me twist. "Then stay close," he murmured. "You'll see soon enough." The rain intensified, streaking the windows like tears, and I realized how quiet the city sounded from up here. How far away everything normal felt. I stood to leave, unsure if I should thank him, or curse him, or both. But before I reached the elevator, he spoke again. "Imani." It was the first time he had said my name without the formality, without the barrier of Miss Cole, and hearing it in his mouth felt intimate, disarming, almost dangerous. "Yes." He didn't turn to look at me, just stared out the window at the glittering sprawl below. "Don't make me regret letting you live." The words hit like a blade hidden in velvet, and yet there was something else in them too. A strange kind of confession, an acknowledgement that he could have ended me and didn't, that for reasons I couldn't yet grasp, he wanted me alive, in his world, near his fire. When the elevator doors closed behind me, my reflection stared back from the mirrored walls. The same face, the same woman. But her eyes looked different now. Darker, older, touched by something that couldn't be undone. And as the elevator descended, I realized with a kind of quiet horror that it wasn't fear keeping me awake inside that glass box. It was anticipation. Because for all the danger, for all the control, for all the ways I knew he could break me, I couldn't stop wondering what it would feel like to make him lose his composure, just once. And that thought, more than anything else, was the beginning of my undoing. The next morning began not with sunlight, but with silence. That heavy, deliberate kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like being watched. And as I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror of the penthouse guest room they had assigned me, I realized I had not so much woken up as resurfaced from a night spent half dreaming, half dreading, caught between the echo of Jamin's voice and the strange awareness that my life, my autonomy, my sense of self had been folded into a world that didn't recognize either mercy or exit doors. The clothes laid out for me on the chair were too elegant to feel like a suggestion. Tailored slacks in muted cream, a silk blouse the color of champagne, and a thin gold bracelet that wasn't mine but fit perfectly, as if someone had already measured my wrists while I slept. I stared at them for a long time, torn between resentment and resignation. And though a part of me wanted to throw them aside and walk out in defiance, another, quieter part whispered that surviving sometimes meant pretending to cooperate long enough to learn the rules of the game. When I finally stepped into the main hall, the penthouse was already alive in a way that made my skin prickle. Men moving quietly, efficiently, carrying papers and sealed boxes, their movements choreographed, their expressions neutral, as if they were pieces in a larger machine that never stopped running. The floor gleamed like water. The walls were lined with art that felt too perfect to be legal. And through the tall windows, the city below shimmered beneath a sky heavy with unshed rain. Jamin was there, of course, standing near the marble counter, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as a blade in its sheath. He wore black again, though this time the fabric looked softer. his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a trace of skin that made me look away faster than I wanted to admit. "You're punctual today," he said without turning, his tone calm, detached, as if we had already fallen into some unspoken rhythm of expectation and observation. "I figured lateness wasn't a risk worth taking twice," I replied, keeping my voice level, though I hated how aware I was of him. The weight of his presence, the precision of his movements, the quiet power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He glanced over his shoulder, his mouth curving just slightly. "Smart." A woman appeared beside him, elegant and severe, her black hair pulled tight, her expression one of permanent disapproval. "This is Mrs. Park," he said. "She oversees my operations. You'll report to her when I'm unavailable." Mrs. Park inclined her head, not quite a bow, not quite a nod, her gaze scanning me with the efficiency of a scanner, as though measuring the worth of my existence in seconds. "We have a collection to review," she said briskly. "Follow me." We descended by private elevator to a level I hadn't known existed, a floor below the penthouse, cold and sterile, lit by soft recessed lights that cast everything in an unsettling gold. The air smelled faintly of varnish and secrecy, and when the doors opened, I saw what could only be described as an underground museum. Walls lined with paintings, sculptures, relics, all of them priceless, all of them stolen. I froze. "This is contraband," she finished for me, her tone devoid of apology. "Recovered from private collectors who didn't understand the meaning of ownership. You'll catalog these and prepare them for transfer to our European clients." I wanted to ask how they had been recovered, wanted to ask how many people had bled to get them here. But her tone, her eyes, the quiet hum of surveillance cameras along the ceiling, all told me that questions weren't part of the job description. For the next few hours, I lost myself in the art. Not the legality, not the ethics, just the beauty. My hands trembled as I traced the edges of ancient scrolls, as I studied brushwork that belonged to centuries past, as I catalogued paintings whose provenance had been wiped clean like erased sins. Somewhere between revulsion and reverence, I realized I was doing exactly what he wanted, preserving his illusion that he wasn't a thief but a curator of chaos, a man who believed that power could rewrite the definition of beauty itself. When I looked up from a sculpture of a kneeling woman carved in ivory, Jae-min was there, leaning against the glass doorway, watching me. I hadn't heard him enter. "You handle them like they're alive," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. I wiped my hands on the white gloves Mrs. Park had given me, trying to steady my breath. "Because they are," I said. "Every piece in this room was touched by someone's dream, someone's hand, someone's story. You can steal an object, but not its ghost." He smiled faintly, that enigmatic curl of the lips that was neither amusement nor kindness. "You talk like an artist." "I'm not," I replied. "I just know what it costs to lose something that can't be replaced." Our eyes met then, and for a moment everything else, the guards, the silence, the invisible cameras, seemed to dissolve. There was something in his expression I hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not threat, but a flicker of recognition, maybe even respect. It was gone a second later, replaced by that usual mask of control. But I saw it, and it changed something small but irreversible between us. Lunch was served in the penthouse, though calling it lunch felt ridiculous. It was a ritual. A table set for two. Dishes arranged like artwork, the view of Seoul's skyline glittering behind us like a mirage of freedom I could no longer reach. "Do you always eat alone?" I asked, breaking the silence as he poured tea into delicate white porcelain cups. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "People are unreliable dinner guests when they owe you their lives." "Then why invite me?" His eyes lingered on me for a long, heavy second. "Because you haven't decided what you owe me yet." The words slid under my skin like silk and steel, and though I tried to mask it with sarcasm, My voice betrayed me. That sounds like a threat. Maybe it's a reminder, he said softly. Freedom isn't free, Miss Cole. Someone always pays for it. After we ate, he dismissed the staff with a wave of his hand, the room falling into a strange kind of intimacy that felt both deliberate and dangerous. I should have left then. Should have thanked him and returned to the safety of distance. But when he motioned toward the piano in the corner, a black Steinway that gleamed like oil, curiosity won over common sense. Do you play? I asked, moving closer, my fingers brushing the cool ivory keys. He nodded, his gaze softening as he joined me. My mother taught me, he said quietly, before she died. There was a stillness in his tone that didn't belong to the man I'd seen order, command, and threaten without hesitation. It was fragile, human. I didn't know what to say, so I did the only thing that felt right. I pressed a single key, the sound echoing through the room like a heartbeat in a cathedral. He sat beside me, his sleeve brushing mine, and for a moment, our hands rested near the same chord, so close that the air between them hummed. Be careful, Imani, he murmured, his voice softer now, almost intimate. My world has a way of making people forget who they were before they entered it. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the power, but the loneliness that shadowed it. The exhaustion of a man who could control everything except the parts of himself that still remembered tenderness. And that realization, that glimpse of the man beneath the myth, frightened me more than all his threats combined. Because I knew, deep down, that the more I saw him as human, the more likely I was to lose what was left of myself. As the night deepened and the rain returned, I retreated to my room, the echo of piano notes following me like ghosts down the hall. The city lights flickered below, the wind whispering against the glass, and for the first time since I'd entered his world, I realized that this wasn't captivity in the traditional sense. It was something far subtler, far more dangerous. It was comfort disguised as control, beauty draped over brutality, a cage so exquisitely crafted that you almost forgot it was made to keep you inside. And as I lay awake, the gold bracelet on my wrist catching the dim light from the window, I couldn't shake the haunting certainty that Jae-min Kwan didn't just want obedience. He wanted something far deeper, something infinitely riskier. He wanted to be understood. And the moment I gave him that, I would never escape him again. I don't remember exactly when I stopped counting the days, when the mornings began to blur into one long stretch of polished silence and unspoken commands, when I began to understand that in Jaemin's world, time didn't move. It circled him, as if the sun itself revolved around his moods and decisions, and I had been pulled into his orbit like some unwilling satellite, caught between fear and fascination, spinning closer with every breath I took. The work he gave me was meticulous, relentless, and strangely hypnotic. Each piece of art I handled felt like a fragment of history, stolen from its rightful place. Every brushstroke a reminder of beauty surviving in captivity, just as I was. I tried to convince myself that it was only temporary, that once I fulfilled my so-called debt, I could return to my life, to normalcy, to a world that didn't belong to men like him. But normal began to feel like a story I had once told myself to fall asleep. The nights were the hardest. The city lights bled through the windows like liquid gold, the air humming with the sound of rain against glass. And sometimes, in that delicate quiet between midnight and morning, I could hear the piano again. Soft, mournful, the same melody he had played that first night I saw the loneliness behind his control. I would listen from the hallway, standing barefoot on the cold marble, the notes threading through the air like a confession meant for no one and yet somehow finding me. It was on one of those nights that everything shifted. Mrs. Park had been away handling a shipment, and the penthouse felt emptier than usual. I was reviewing documentation for an acquisition, a painting that had allegedly vanished during the Japanese occupation, when a knock at my door startled me. It wasn't a polite tap. It was quiet but firm, deliberate, and before I could answer, the door opened. He stood there. No jacket, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hair slightly disheveled in a way that made him look less untouchable and more devastatingly human. There was something dangerous about that casualness, something intimate in the fact that he had come himself instead of sending someone else. "You're still working," he said, his voice low, not accusing but edged with something unreadable. "It's what you asked me to do," I replied, setting down the file. "Unless I misunderstood your definition of debt repayment." His lips curved. Not quite a smile, more like a shadow of one. "You didn't. But you don't have to live in it." I should have thanked him, maybe, should have found some diplomatic way to ease the tension that always seemed to hum between us like static before lightning. But instead I met his gaze and said, "You built this cage. Don't act surprised I'm trying to decorate it." For a moment neither of us spoke. His eyes, dark and steady, studied me with that unsettling patience that made me feel like he was cataloging every breath I took. Then, without a word, he crossed the room and stopped in front of me. "Do you hate me?" he asked, his tone quiet, almost reflective, as if the answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. I wanted to say yes, to hurl the word at him like a weapon, to make him flinch, but the truth tangled somewhere between my ribs and my throat. Hate was too simple for what I felt. It didn't account for the heat that coiled in my stomach when he stood this close, or the way my pulse raced not from fear but from something darker, heavier, something I didn't dare name. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. "But I wish I did." He exhaled, slow and quiet. And in that moment, something shifted in his expression. Not weakness, not apology, but a flicker of vulnerability, as brief and blinding as a match in the dark. He reached up, not abruptly, not possessively, just enough for his fingers to brush the side of my face, his touch light, careful, almost reverent. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him that I was here because he'd forced me to be, that this proximity was a privilege I hadn't asked for, that every fiber of my being should have recoiled. But instead I froze, caught between anger and want, between defiance and surrender. His hand lingered at my jaw, his thumb grazing my skin in a way that made it impossible to breathe evenly. "You're trembling," he murmured. "I'm angry," I lied. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing with faint amusement. "Maybe. But anger doesn't make your pulse do that." My heart hammered so hard I thought he might actually hear it. The air between us felt electric, heavy with things neither of us would say. I stepped back, breaking the contact, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "You don't get to touch me like that." His expression didn't change, but his voice did. Lower now, quieter, threaded with something dangerous. "And yet you didn't stop me." I hated the truth in that. I hated that my body betrayed the lines my mind kept drawing. Because I didn't want to give you the satisfaction. He smiled then, slow, dark, devastating. "You think this is about satisfaction?" "No, Imani, this is about control. You keep fighting me, but you don't even realize that the more you resist, the more you become a part of my gravity." The words hit deeper than I expected. I turned away, crossing to the window, the city lights blurring beneath the drizzle. "Maybe you should stop mistaking curiosity for control," I said, my voice low but steady. "You can command my body, my work, my time, but you can't command my thoughts." He stepped closer, and I felt his presence before I saw him, the quiet weight of him behind me, the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of cedar and danger. His reflection appeared beside mine in the ting glass, our eyes meeting not in reality but in the mirror's surface, and there was something haunting about the symmetry of it, as if we were two people on opposite sides of the same sin, I don't want your obedience, he said softly. I want your attention. There's a difference. I turned then, my heart thundering. And what happens when you have it? He smiled, not cruelly, but with the kind of confidence that made me both furious and afraid. Then you'll stop pretending you don't already. For a moment, the storm outside felt like an echo of the one inside me. I should have pushed him away, screamed, demanded distance. But instead I found myself stepping closer, as if some unspoken force was pulling us together despite every rational reason to resist. His hand found my wrist, not forcefully, but with a grip that was more possessive than gentle. And when his thumb brushed the pulse there, it felt like he was reading me through touch alone. Tell me to stop, he said quietly. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The silence was louder than any answer. And then he kissed me. It wasn't tender. It was restrained fury. A collision of everything we hadn't said. Everything we shouldn't feel. Everything that had been building between us since that night in the gallery. His mouth was firm, his breath rough, his control barely leashed, and for a moment I forgot where I was, who he was, who I had been before him. It was madness, it was surrender, it was fire wrapped in silk. And when I finally pulled back, breathless, my heart felt like it had cracked open. He didn't apologize, didn't explain, just looked at me, really looked, and said in a voice that shook something deep inside me, "You should hate me for that." "Maybe I do," I whispered, "but not enough." He stepped back then, the distance sudden and deliberate, his mask slipping back into place. "Go to bed, Miss Cole," he said softly, his tone almost formal again, though his eyes betrayed the storm beneath, "before we both make another mistake." When he left, the door closing with a quiet click, I stood there for a long time, my lips still burning, my pulse still echoing his name. I told myself it was just a moment, just confusion, just proximity playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Because what scared me wasn't that he had kissed me. It was that a part of me had kissed him back. And that small, unforgivable truth was the one thing I couldn't take back. It happened 3 nights after the kiss. Not that fleeting, dangerous thing I kept pretending hadn't burned its mark into me, but the other one. The one that tore the veil off the illusion I had been foolish enough to believe in. The one that showed me exactly what kind of man Jae-min Kwon truly was beneath the tailored silk and the quiet, lethal charm that made him seem almost human. The evening had begun like so many others, with soft music echoing through the penthouse, the low hum of conversation between men who wore danger as easily as they wore their cufflinks, and that ever-present undercurrent of tension that moved through the air like static before a storm. I had been cataloging a set of rare prints from a private collection when I noticed something off. A stillness too complete, the kind that didn't belong in spaces full of breathing men. And then the voices stopped altogether. When I stepped into the main hall, the scene unfolded like a painting done in violence. 2 of Jaemin's men stood near the entrance, one gripping the collar of a stranger who was on his knees, blood already blooming through his white shirt like some grotesque flower. Jae-min stood a few feet away, calm, precise, his expression unreadable but his eyes cold enough to silence the world. I froze, unable to look away, and for a long, excruciating moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint trickle of rain outside and the man's uneven breathing, ragged, shallow, desperate. I didn't know who he was, but I knew enough to recognize fear that had already accepted its fate. "Please," the man said, his Korean broken by sobs, his hands shaking as he clutched at the hem of Jaemin's trousers. "It wasn't me, I swear. I didn't— Enough," Jae-min said softly, the words slicing through the air like glass. He knelt, not with pity, not even with anger, but with a kind of deliberate patience that chilled me more than any shout could have. "You lied to me," he said, almost gently. and lies in my house have a cost." The man tried to speak again, but before he could, Jamin's hand moved, swift, almost invisible. And the sound that followed was not loud, not cinematic, just the dull, wet thud of inevitability. I didn't see the blade until it was already red. I think I made a sound. Small, strangled, a gasp torn from somewhere deep inside. Because Jamin's head turned toward me immediately, his expression still composed, but his gaze sharp, assessing. For a second, neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to contract until there was only him, me, and the blood pooling on marble between us. "Imani," he said quietly, as if my name were an anchor, a tether keeping him from something darker. I wanted to run, to scream, to break something, but my legs wouldn't move. "You killed him," I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded distant, as if I were listening from outside my own body. "He was already dead," Jamin replied, his tone maddeningly calm. He just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The cruelty of the words stunned me, not because of what they meant, but because of how effortlessly he said them, as though they were fact, not horror. "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Because he betrayed me," he said simply, standing now, cleaning the blade with a white handkerchief that would soon be discarded like evidence. "Because loyalty isn't a suggestion here, it's survival. And because if I let one man deceive me, 10 others will follow." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "That doesn't justify murder." He looked at me then, really looked, and something in his gaze softened, just slightly. "You think the world cares about justification? You think the police, the courts, the people who build empires on bones care about right and wrong? No, Imani. The only law that matters is consequence." His words should have disgusted me, but what terrified me most was that part of me understood them. The men began cleaning the mess with mechanical precision, their silence more unsettling than any apology could be. I turned away, my stomach twisting, my hands shaking. I made it halfway to the door before I felt his presence behind me, that quiet, inevitable gravity that always followed. "Don't walk away from this," he said softly. "If you turn your back now, you'll never understand what I am, or what you've chosen to be part of." I spun around, anger breaking through the shock. "I didn't choose any of this. You forced me into it. You and your contracts and your threats and your games." He took a step closer, unflinching. "And yet you stayed." The words hit me like a slap. He wasn't wrong. I could have run weeks ago. Could have found a way to disappear, to hide, to start over. But I hadn't. And the worst part was, I didn't know why. "Don't twist this into something it's not," I said, though my voice wavered. "I'm here because I have no choice." He reached out, his fingers brushing my chin, tilting my face up toward his. "There's always a choice," he murmured. "The difference is whether you can live with it." The scent of blood and rain hung between us, sharp and heavy. And for the first time I saw what lay beneath his composure. Not pride, not even cruelty, but weariness. The kind that comes from carrying too many ghosts. "Does it ever stop?" I asked, my voice small. "The killing, the pretending." His expression didn't change, but his eyes, those impossible, unblinking eyes, betrayed something fleeting and fragile. "No," he said quietly, "but you learn to breathe around it." Something broke inside me then. Not pity, not forgiveness, but understanding. And that was worse. Because once you start to understand a monster, it's too easy to forget what he's capable of. Later that night, I found him on the balcony, the city stretched below like a map of light and sin, the wind carrying the scent of rain and smoke. He stood there with a glass in his hand, his shirt still stained faintly at the cuff, his posture relaxed, though his eyes were fixed on something far beyond the horizon. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly from the doorway. He didn't turn. Regret is for people who think they could have done something differently. "And you couldn't?" He took a slow sip of his drink, then said, "When you live long enough in this world, you stop believing in choices. Everything becomes reaction. Survival, retaliation, defense. The luxury of regret is for those who are safe enough to have it." I stepped closer, unsure why I was even still there, unsure why the sight of him against the glittering night made my chest ache. "Then what's the point?" I whispered. "What's left?" He looked at me then, and for once the mask was gone. "Control," he said simply. "The illusion of it. Because if I ever lose that, even for a second, everything I've built turns to ash." His voice was quiet but brittle, and I realized with a strange, terrible clarity that for all his power, Jae-min Kwon was a man perpetually at war. Not with the world, but with himself. And maybe that's why I didn't walk away. Maybe that's why I stood beside him, feeling the wind pull at my hair, the distance between us alive with everything we couldn't say. Because beneath the blood and the arrogance, beneath the empire and the cruelty, I saw a man who had been made into a weapon and was too proud to admit that he wanted to be more than what forged him. I should have hated him more after what I'd seen. But I didn't. And that terrified me more than the violence itself. When I finally turned to leave, he caught my wrist. Not hard, not possessive, just enough to make me stop. His voice, when he spoke, was low, almost broken. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said. "Now you'll never look at me the same." I met his gaze, the city burning in the reflection of his eyes. "Maybe that's the point," I whispered. "Maybe it's time I stop pretending I don't." For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly he let me go. As I walked back into the penthouse, my hands still trembling, my pulse still loud in my ears, I knew something irrevocable had happened. Not just to him, but to me. Because understanding him meant carrying a part of his darkness inside me. And once that kind of shadow takes root, it never leaves. And in the silence that followed, I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I was afraid of what I was becoming beside him. There comes a moment, in every dangerous relationship, when fear stops being the thing that keeps you quiet and becomes the thing that makes you speak. Not because courage suddenly blooms inside you like some noble revelation, but because silence begins to feel like suffocation. And you realize that obedience, once it becomes habit, starts eroding whatever parts of yourself you still recognize. For me, that moment came on a night thick with cigarette smoke and rain, when the penthouse that had once gleamed like a temple now felt like a cage closing in around me. The men had gathered, Jaemin's lieutenants, his inner circle, those faceless soldiers of order and violence who bowed when he entered and looked away when he smiled, and I had been asked to attend. I didn't know why, only that Mrs. Park had appeared at my door with that expressionless mask of hers and said, "The boss requires your presence." The room they led me to wasn't like the others I'd seen. No marble, no chandeliers, no curated art to disguise the ugliness beneath the luxury. It was bare concrete, a table in the center, chairs lined around it, and men whose gazes carried a kind of restrained cruelty that made the air feel heavier with every passing second. Jae-min sat at the head, poised, calm, a glass of soju untouched before him. He didn't look at me immediately, which was somehow worse. He simply spoke, his voice low but cutting, as if carved from ice. "We have a problem," he said, his tone so measured it made every man in the room sit straighter. "Someone has been leaking information about our transfers to the rival syndicate in Busan." No one dared breathe. "I trusted one of you," he continued, his eyes sweeping over them, "and one of you betrayed me." He nodded to one of his men, who dragged forward a trembling boy, young, barely out of his teens, his wrists bound, his face pale. I recognized him from the logistics floor, one of the quiet assistants who cataloged shipments and filed records without ever meeting anyone's gaze. He was shaking so hard I could hear the chains around his wrists clinking in the stillness. "Please," the boy whispered, voice cracking. I swear I didn't." Jamin rose slowly, and though he didn't raise his voice, every word he spoke carried that same weightless authority that made people obey before they even realized they'd submitted. "You were seen delivering a list of my shipments to a Busan intermediary. You used my resources, my name, my trust. Do you deny it?" The boy sobbed. "I didn't mean... my sister. They said they'd hurt her if I didn't." I don't know what possessed me then. Maybe exhaustion, maybe rage, maybe that quiet, unkillable part of me that still refused to accept that power gave anyone the right to decide who lived and who didn't. But I stepped forward before I even realized I was moving. "Stop," I said, my voice cutting through the room like glass shattering. Every head turned toward me, but only one gaze mattered. His. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The boy froze, the guards stiffened, and Jamin looked at me with something that wasn't surprise exactly, but rather the kind of slow, dangerous curiosity reserved for someone who'd just walked barefoot into a field of landmines. "What did you say?" he asked softly. I swallowed hard, but my voice didn't waver. "You heard me. He's just a kid. You said it yourself. Someone coerced him. If your enemies used his sister, then your real problem isn't him. It's the people who knew how to reach one of yours." He stared at me, unreadable, and then, to the horror of everyone around the table, he smiled. It wasn't amusement, not really. It was something sharper, darker, like the slow pull of a blade being drawn from its sheath. "You presume to tell me how to run my house?" "I'm telling you," I said, forcing my voice to hold steady even as my pulse raced, "that killing him won't solve your problem. It'll only prove that you'd rather punish fear than fix it." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then slowly, deliberately, he walked toward me. His footsteps echoed on the concrete, steady and measured, each one a test of whether I would flinch. When he stopped in front of me, the distance between us barely a breath, his voice dropped to a whisper that only I could hear. "You're brave when you should be silent," he murmured. "Do you know what happens to people who embarrass me in front of my men?" My heart was a drum against my ribs, but I lifted my chin. "Maybe they start to remind you what it feels like to be human." Something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not yet, but something more dangerous, because it wasn't rage that terrified me about Jamin. It was restraint, the way he could hold violence so tightly inside him that you almost believed he wouldn't use it, until he did. He turned away, facing the boy again. The room held its breath. Then, without a word, he gestured for his men to release him. "Get him out," he said. The boy collapsed in relief, sobbing incoherently, and 2 guards carried him out before anyone could question the decision. The remaining men exchanged wary glances, confusion flickering across faces too disciplined to show it fully. Jamin sat back down, poured himself a drink, and didn't speak again until everyone but Mrs. Park and I had left the room. When the door closed behind them, he finally looked up at me, his eyes unreadable. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" "Yes," I said, though my hands were trembling. "I stopped you from making another ghost." He rose, slowly, and crossed the room until he was close enough that I could see the faint pulse in his throat, the tension in his jaw, the storm beneath his calm. "You humiliated me," he said quietly, "in front of men who measure loyalty and fear. You undermined me and they saw it." "Then maybe they saw something you've forgotten how to show," I said, my voice breaking but refusing to back down. "Control doesn't always mean cruelty, Jamin." The way he looked at me then, like he was trying to decide whether to strangle me or kiss me, made every nerve in my body tighten. You think you understand me, he said softly. But you don't. You see pieces and mistake them for the whole. Then show me the whole, I shot back, my words trembling but fierce. Show me something that isn't built on fear. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, without warning, his hand slammed into the wall beside my head, the sound sharp, violent, final. I didn't flinch, not because I wasn't afraid, but because something inside me refused to give him that satisfaction. His breath was rough, his voice a low growl. Do you have any idea what you do to me? He whispered. You stand there, defying me, challenging me, and you have no idea how close I am to... He stopped himself, his jaw tightening, his control snapping back into place like a mask being slammed shut. He stepped back, exhaling harshly, running a hand through his hair. You shouldn't be here, he said finally. Not tonight. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers, but instead, I turned toward the door, my voice shaking with exhaustion. Maybe I shouldn't be here at all. I walked out before he could reply. Back in my room, I stood by the window, staring at the city, my reflection a stranger's face looking back at me. My hands were still trembling, my pulse still frantic. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Something that felt like pride, sharp and fragile but real. I had stood up to him. I had forced him to see me not as one of his possessions, not as another obedient silence, but as a woman who refused to bow. And yet, even as I tried to convince myself that I'd won something, a part of me knew better. Because the look in his eyes before I walked away, that mixture of anger, desire, and something dangerously close to admiration, told me that my defiance hadn't pushed him away. It had pulled him closer. There are nights that split a life into before and after. Moments that come without warning, but carve themselves so deeply into your bones that no amount of time can sand down their edges. And the night they came for me, the night blood and loyalty and obsession collided in a way that could never be undone, was the moment I stopped pretending that Jamin's world could ever be survived cleanly. It began with a phone call I almost didn't answer. The city outside was humming beneath the weight of a low fog, its lights blurred into streaks of color through the rain-slick windows of the penthouse. And I had been sitting on the floor of my room, surrounded by open folders and sketches, trying to distract myself from the echo of our last confrontation. The sound of his hand slamming the wall, the fury in his voice, the part of me that had wanted to touch him even as I hated myself for it. The phone buzzed once, twice, then again, until I picked it up, thinking it was Mrs. Park or one of the handlers calling about an inventory list. It wasn't. All I heard at first was breathing, uneven, hurried, and then a voice I recognized, one of the junior runners from the acquisition team, trembling as he spoke my name. Imani, he said, you need to get out. Now, they're coming. Who? I asked, rising to my feet, my pulse quickening. But the line had already gone dead. For a moment I stood there, frozen, staring at the phone as if willing it to ring again. But then the lights flickered, once, twice, and I heard it. The sound of boots in the hall, heavy, deliberate. Too many to belong to Jamin's usual guards. Panic hit like a surge of ice through my veins. I didn't think. I grabbed the small dagger I kept hidden in the drawer, one of the ceremonial pieces from the art collection, more symbolic than practical, but it was all I had. The door burst open. 3 men in dark clothing stormed in, faces half covered, movements quick and practiced. One shouted something in Korean I didn't understand, another lunged toward me, and I did the only thing I could. I ran. The blade in my hand flashed uselessly as I pushed past them, heart pounding, breath shallow, the sound of footsteps and curses chasing me down the corridor. The world narrowed to the rhythm of my pulse and the echo of my own fear. I made it to the elevator, but before I could press the button, one of them caught my arm, spinning me around. His grip was iron, his eyes empty. And for a second I thought this was how it ended. that my stubborn pride, my refusal to bow, had finally delivered me to the consequence I'd been dancing around for weeks. But before he could drag me back, the sound of gunfire exploded through the hall. Sharp, deafening, final. The man jerked, his body going slack, blood blooming across his chest like a dark, sudden flower, and behind him, Jae-min stood, a gun still raised, his expression a storm of cold fury. "Get down," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. I dropped to the floor as he fired again. 2 shots, then 3. The corridor filling with smoke and screams, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. The last man fell near the elevator, a shadow collapsing into silence. And then, for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain against the windows and the echo of my own trembling breath. Jae-min lowered the gun slowly, his chest heaving, his shirt splattered with blood. Not his, not mine, just the crimson evidence of what it meant to live in his world. When his eyes found mine, they weren't cold anymore. They were something worse. Raw, unguarded, almost terrified. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing the distance between us before I could answer, his hands gripping my arms, scanning me for injuries as if he couldn't believe I was still alive. I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "What was that?" "Who were they?" "Busan," he said through clenched teeth. "The syndicate we've been tracking. Someone told them where you were, someone from inside." My heart stuttered. "So it was a setup?" He didn't answer, but the silence was loud enough. He turned to one of his men, the only one still standing, and barked an order I didn't catch. Within minutes, the hall was swarming with guards, the bodies carried out, the blood already, being scrubbed from the floor, as if erasing the evidence could erase what had just happened. I followed him to his office, still shaking, still trying to make sense of how close I'd come to dying. When he finally stopped, he poured 2 drinks with hands that weren't as steady as usual, then set one in front of me without looking up. "They knew exactly where to find you," he said quietly. "That means someone here told them." The word betrayal hung between us like a curse. I swallowed the drink, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to burn away the taste of fear still clinging to my tongue. "Why me?" I asked. "Why target me?" He met my eyes then, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something close to guilt. "Because you're the only thing they could use against me?" I froze. "Against you?" He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "They know I'd come for you." For a moment, the room tilted. "You mean," I said slowly, "they knew you cared." The word hung there, cared, fragile, forbidden, a truth neither of us was ready to own. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "They knew I wouldn't let them take you," he said, his voice rougher now. "They were right." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. My throat tightened, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Then why keep me here like a prisoner if you're going to act like my protector?" He looked at me for a long time, his gaze searching mine as if trying to decide whether to tell me the truth or bury me in another lie. Finally, he said, "Because if I let you go, someone else will try to take you, and I don't share what's mine." Anger flared, bright, painful, familiar. "I'm not yours, Jae-min." He stepped closer, his breath hot against my skin, his voice low and unsteady. "Then why does it feel like you are?" The air between us crackled with everything we shouldn't say. I wanted to shove him away, to remind him of the blood still drying on his hands, to tell him that his protection felt too much like possession. But when his fingers brushed my face, gentle this time, trembling, I realized that the man who had just killed 3 people without hesitation was shaking now. Not from violence, but from something far more dangerous. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, and the confession broke something inside me, because it wasn't control I heard in his voice. It was fear. Before I could respond, he kissed me. Not like before, not angry or desperate, but like a man trying to prove he was still alive. Like someone clinging to the only thing in reach while the world burned around him. His hands tangled in my hair. His breath tasted of whiskey and rain. And though every rational part of me screamed to stop, to remember who he was, my body betrayed me again, answering the chaos with hunger, confusion, longing. When we finally broke apart, the silence between us was unbearable. He stepped back first, his expression unreadable once more, the mask settling back over his features. "This changes nothing," he said quietly. "You're still not safe." And then he turned away, his shoulders tense, his voice barely audible when he added, "Neither am I." I stood there long after he left, the scent of blood and rain still clinging to the air, the memory of his touch burning like a brand. The city beyond the glass glittered like nothing had happened, as if the world could go on indifferent to the bodies and the confessions it left behind. But I knew better now. Because somewhere in that night, between the gunfire, the fear, and the taste of his lips, something inside me crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I wasn't just surviving his world anymore. I was part of it. And the most terrifying part of all was that I wasn't sure I wanted to leave. There are moments after violence when silence feels heavier than sound, when the world holds its breath as if afraid to move forward, and in the days that followed the attack, the air inside Jamin's penthouse was thick with that silence. Not peace, not calm, but the brittle quiet of people who are pretending nothing inside them has cracked. I told myself I was fine, that I was functioning, that the trembling in my hands would stop once my body understood it had survived. But even in sleep, I could still hear the gunfire, still see the blood spreading across the marble floor, still feel the way Jamin's hand had gripped my arm, as if anchoring me to a world I no longer recognized. He had doubled the guards, sealed the penthouse, and rarely left my side, but his presence, once magnetic, now felt suffocating, a reminder that my safety was no longer freedom, but captivity, disguised as protection. Every room I entered smelled faintly of antiseptic and gun oil, and when I passed the men in suits stationed near the doors, they bowed slightly. Not out of respect for me, but because I was the woman their boss had nearly died to protect. The woman who had somehow become his weakness. It should have made me feel powerful, but instead it hollowed me out. He moved through those days like a shadow. Quieter, sharper, haunted. I watched him on the balcony at night, smoking in silence, his profile carved against the city lights, and though I wanted to ask what he was thinking, I already knew the answer. Revenge. He was building something again. Some retaliation cloaked in strategy. And the part of me that had once admired his precision now saw it for what it was. An addiction to control. A need to prove that nothing and no one could touch what was his. But what terrified me more than his violence was how much I still wanted to understand him, how much of my own soul had begun to mirror his darkness. I caught myself one night tracing the faint scar near his collarbone, one I hadn't noticed before, and instead of flinching from what it meant, I found myself wondering who had given it to him, who had dared to hurt him, and why the thought of anyone else leaving their mark on him made something in me twist in jealousy and shame. That was the moment I knew love had turned into something unrecognizable, something more like madness than devotion, more like surrender than trust. I told myself I would leave, that as soon as things calmed down, I would disappear, find a flight, a new name, a city where no one spoke his language or mine. I even packed once, a small suitcase with only the essentials, my passport tucked between two shirts, my hands shaking as I zipped it shut. But when I reached the door, 2 guards stepped aside automatically, and one of them said, "The boss asked that you wait for him before going anywhere." and suddenly it didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like betrayal. That night he came to me again. Not with threats or orders, but quietly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure whether I'd let him in. He looked exhausted, his hair slightly undone, his tie hanging loose, and for the first time I saw the cracks not in his empire but in him. "I can't keep you safe if you keep trying to run," he said softly. I wanted to tell him that safety wasn't the same as being alive, that walls built high enough to keep danger out also kept the sky from being seen. But the words died in my throat when I looked at him. Because the man standing in front of me wasn't the untouchable boss everyone feared. He was a man who hadn't slept in days, who carried guilt like armor, who didn't know how to love without consuming. "You can't control everything," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You can't fix the world by breaking everyone who defies you." He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I don't want to fix the world," he said. "I just don't want it to take you from me." His confession landed like a blow, beautiful and horrifying all at once. Because in that instant, I realized that to him, love and possession were the same words spoken in different tongues, and every act of protection was also an act of control. When he touched me, I didn't stop him. Maybe I should have. Maybe that was the moment to draw the line, to remind us both that affection born of fear can't survive the daylight, but instead, I let him close the distance. Let his hands trace the path of my jaw, the curve of my throat, the place where my pulse betrayed everything I didn't say. His kiss was slower this time, not anger, but exhaustion, and I hated how much I needed it. How much of my strength evaporated in the warmth of his mouth against mine. We fell together, not gracefully, not romantically, but like two people who had both been falling for far too long, clinging to each other not because it was right, but because letting go would mean hitting the ground alone. When it was over, when the silence returned and our breathing steadied, I lay there staring at the ceiling, tracing the shape of the chandelier's reflection on the wall, realizing that I wasn't sure whether I'd just been loved or claimed. He turned to me, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his voice low and unsteady. "If anything happens to me," he said, "you go to the safe in my office behind the painting. There's a file there. You'll know what to do." The words chilled me. "What do you mean, if anything happens?" He didn't answer. He only looked at me for a long time, his gaze so intense it felt like a goodbye he wasn't ready to say. I wanted to demand the truth, to make him promise that whatever war he was planning wouldn't swallow us both. But before I could speak, there was a knock on the door. Sharp, urgent, 3 short raps that didn't belong in moments like this. He stood, pulling on his shirt, his expression shifting instantly from vulnerable to controlled. "What is it?" he called out, and Mrs. Park's voice came through thin and strained. "It's happened," she said. "The Busan leader. He's here. He wants a meeting." Jae-min stiffened. "Here." "In the building?" she replied. "He came with a truce offer. Says he wants to end the bloodshed." I felt the air shift, a heaviness, a tension that vibrated through him like a struck chord. He turned back to me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes that had always been a mirror for everything he refused to say, held something that looked too much like finality. "Stay here," he said quietly. "No matter what happens, you don't come out. Promise me." "Jae-min, promise me." The command in his tone was enough to make me nod even as my chest tightened. He touched my cheek once, briefly, then turned and walked out. The sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor until the door closed behind him, and the silence swallowed everything again. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 20. Each second felt like a thread pulled tighter around my heart. I tried to convince myself that he was fine, that this was just another negotiation, that his calm could bend the rules of the world the way it always did. But then, faintly, distantly, I heard shouting, and then a gunshot. The sound froze me where I stood. Another followed. Then silence. I ran before reason could stop me, my bare feet slipping on the polished floor as I reached the corridor, the echoes of voices sharp and panicked down the hall. The guards were gone. The air smelled of smoke, and when I turned the corner toward his office, I saw Mrs. Park kneeling beside the open door, her hands pressed to her mouth. Inside, through the haze, I saw Jae-min on the floor. Still, motionless, crimson spreading across the front of his shirt like the petals of a dying flower. The gun lay near his hand, and for one impossible, breaking second, the world stopped moving. The moment I saw him lying there, everything inside me went still. Not in the way death stills a body, but in the way grief stills the air. Like the world itself is holding its breath because it knows something irreversible has happened. The sound that tore out of me wasn't a scream exactly, but something older, deeper. The kind of sound that comes from a place beyond language, where love and loss meet in the same breath and refuse to separate. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands trembling as they pressed against his chest. The fabric already soaked through, warm and slick beneath my fingers, and I whispered his name over and over like a prayer I didn't believe in. Jae-min, please, Jae-min, stay with me. Please don't leave me like this. Because the idea that a man like him, so untouchable, so terrifyingly alive, could be reduced to stillness felt like a violation of nature itself. His eyes fluttered open, just barely, the dark irises glassy but searching. And when they found me, something inside them flickered. Not fear, not even pain, but recognition. The quiet relief of seeing something familiar before the darkness comes. I told you, he whispered, his voice thin and broken, to stay inside. You can yell at me later, I said, choking on tears I couldn't stop. You're going to be fine, do you hear me? He tried to smile, but it came out as a tremor, blood staining his lips. Liar! Don't you dare, I said, pressing harder against the wound, my vision blurring. Don't you dare call me that, not now. He reached up weakly, his fingers brushing my cheek, smearing red across my skin. You were the only thing I didn't plan, he said, and the words hit me harder than any bullet ever could. Behind me I could hear voices, Mrs. Park shouting for help, footsteps pounding down the hall. But all I could see was him, the rise and fall of his chest slowing, the warmth fading beneath my hands. Listen to me, he said, each word a battle. The file, in my office. Take it. Leave tonight. Promise me, Imani. No, I said fiercely, the word tearing out of me. You don't get to make me promises you won't be here to see. His eyes softened, the faintest trace of that old, infuriating smile ghosting across his face. Stubborn until the end. Then his hand slipped from my cheek. And for the first time since I'd met him, Jae-min Kwon, the man who ruled fear, who made the world bend to his will, didn't move again. I don't remember how long I sat there. Just that time stopped being measured in seconds or minutes, only in the steady, unbearable weight of absence. When they finally pulled me away, my hands were red, my clothes stained, and the scent of iron and smoke clung to me like a second skin. Mrs. Park tried to speak, to offer some explanation about betrayal and Busan and the cost of empires, but her words dissolved into the air because none of it mattered. The politics, the money, the revenge. None of it could make sense of the hole he left behind. Later, when the medics came and the guards cleaned the floor, I found myself standing alone in his office, the one place that had always felt like a reflection of his mind, immaculate, cold, full of secrets. The painting on the wall was still slightly ajar, the safe behind it half open, and inside was the file he'd mentioned, a folder thick with documents, ledgers, bank accounts, coded lists of names I didn't recognize. But tucked between them, folded neatly, was something else. A letter, my name written across the envelope in his handwriting, clean and precise. I didn't open it right away. I just stood there, staring at the paper, my heartbeat uneven, my throat burning with the ache of too many things unsaid. When I finally did, the words were short, spare, but heavy enough to crush me. Imani, if you're reading this, it means I failed at the one thing I swore I could control, keeping you alive and far from this world. There are accounts here in your name, documents that will let you disappear, start over, somewhere the name Quan means nothing. Take them and go. Don't come back for ghosts. I've spent my life building walls, but you were the one person who made me want to see the sky again. Don't waste that freedom trying to bring me back. You already did. Jay. I sank to the floor with the letter clutched to my chest, and for a long time I just wept. Not the kind of crying that brings relief, but the kind that leaves you hollow, emptied out, scraped clean from the inside. I wanted to hate him for dying, for leaving, for loving me in a way that ruined us both. But all I could feel was the echo of his presence, the memory of his voice whispering my name like it was the only word he trusted. It took 3 days for me to leave Seoul. The arrangements had already been made, just as he said. New passport, new account, new name, all tucked neatly inside the folder, because even in death, Jae-min had planned every detail. Mrs. Park didn't stop me. She only bowed once, her expression unreadable, and said, "He cared for you more than he ever should have." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The flight was long, the hours dissolving into clouds and static and the dull ache behind my eyes. I stared out the window as the city disappeared beneath me, the lights fading into distance until they looked like nothing more than dying embers scattered across a sheet of glass. I didn't look back. But the truth is, you never really leave someone like him. You carry him. In the way your heart starts racing when the air smells of rain and smoke. In the way certain songs make your throat close. In the way silence stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like a memory. I told myself I was free, that I had survived, that I was the woman who lived. But living, I've learned, isn't the same as being, unbroken. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of him. Not the blood, not the power, but the version of him that existed only in the quiet moments, the man who looked at art like it could still mean something, who touched me like I was a confession he didn't deserve to make. In those dreams, he's still alive, standing by the window, his back to me, the city glowing beneath his hands. And when he turns, his eyes find mine and he says, "You're safe now." And I always wake up before I can answer. The letter still travels with me, folded, worn, edges soft from being held too often. Sometimes I read it just to remind myself that once, even in a world built on cruelty, someone saw me and didn't look away. And though I've built a life since then, a small one, quiet, with no guards or blood or marble walls, there are nights when the wind sounds like soul rain, and I can almost hear his piano, low and steady, playing that same unfinished melody he used to play when he thought no one was listening. Maybe that's what love is in the end. Not the staying, not the survival, but the haunting. The way someone's absence can take up so much space inside you that it becomes its own kind of presence. He used to tell me that freedom always comes with a cost. I never understood what he meant until now. Because the cost of mine was him. And sometimes, when the sky is quiet and the world feels merciful, I like to believe that somewhere, in whatever place men like Jae-min go when their wars are done, he's watching, finally at peace, knowing that the woman who once defied him learned at last how to live.